Thanks for hosting me, Venki. Um, so, in terms of me, I'm an entrepreneur. I've been around, trading and investing in fintech my entire professional life. Trading has been something which has been very close to me. Um, I'm currently working on scaling up a product called Trading Leagues, which is essentially a Dream 11 for stocks. That's probably the easiest way to think about Trading Leagues.
Okay.
Prior to Trading Leagues, I co-founded upstox, which is a stock brokerage in India. We were discussing earlier in terms of where I've lived. I've had the privilege of living in India for 10 years while building up upstox. And I'm currently based in the US, in Austin, Texas,
Okay. Yeah. Where did you live in India?
In India, I was in Mumbai.
Mumbai.
I lived largely in Mumbai. I was in Mumbai for almost 9 years. I also had very brief stints in Noida and in Delhi as well. But growing up, we would visit India all the time, obviously because we're of Indian descent. So my parents would make sure they took me and my brother to India every 2-3 years, and I got very comfortable with the country, and I miss it every day. Even when I'm here.
Nice.
Yeah.
Do you speak Hindi?
I can. You don't want to hear me speak Hindi. I think it's going to probably turn your viewers off. I can understand. And I can hold a conversation. I think it's one of those things where when I'm in India, it just comes back. And I can just start speaking it. At least in my head, it's semi-fluent. In their heads, it's probably not fluent at all. But as long as, the communication gets across and they understand what I'm trying to say,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice. So a little bit into, your previous years, but just before this, before starting Upstox, where were you? You just, finished your education and then directly jumped into entrepreneurship, or you worked in a corporate job and then got into, decided to jump into entrepreneurship? What was it?
Yeah. So, the term entrepreneurship, I think it's funny, right? Because nowadays everyone wants to become an entrepreneur. They teach courses in entrepreneurship, and it seems like the coolest thing to do is to become an entrepreneur. But in my case, I was like an accidental entrepreneur because I didn't know it at the time, but I was essentially an entrepreneur. So I graduated from college with the intent of basically becoming a trader full time, because even when I was in college, I was researching trading, and I was very sure that trading was something that I could see myself doing. So even while I was in college, I started building my first trading models. And then when I graduated, I essentially moved in with my parents because I had no money. And then, and they accepted me and I started trading. And then within a couple of months, I realized that if I incorporated a company as a partnership, then I would save on taxes. And so I incorporated a company, started trading under the company name, and basically I became an entrepreneur because I wasn't necessarily trading on my own anymore. I was trading under the company name. And trading basically was my full-time job, right? So I was a full-time trader for almost 2 years. And then, my brother joined me. And then he and I and my best friend from college, the three of us moved to India to to set up a stock brokerage. And that's essentially how Upstox started, So long story short, I've never worked a corporate job in my life. Again, not something that I deliberately was looking for. It's not like I said, hey, I don't want to work somewhere. It's more that it just kind of happened, And then that, the trading stuff turned into Upstox, which turned into spending 10 years in India.
Okay, nice. So I'll tell you how, my first experience with trading, I think I'd passed my 12th standard and then was going into the college, but then had no clear path. Somehow, this whole game of trading, intraday trading mostly, not the investment, the long-term investments and stuff like that. But the whole point of the whole idea of owning a piece of a company on a daily basis and looking at which stock is going to go up or probably go down. So I got into a trading course, and then tried a little bit. But then I could not really get hold of it, right? It was interesting, it was exciting, it was but I got into it just to make money. What got you into trading? What is that aspect of trading that it's like you probably get into a flow state, right? Otherwise, somebody so they cannot do it for really long unless they get to the flow state, especially in anything for that matter. What is that thing for you?
Yeah, so definitely it was to make money, right? I think trading is one of those things where if someone tells you they're trading and they're not looking to make money, they're lying to you.
Okay.
So it was definitely to make money, and not just make money, but make a lot of money, right? And the ability to take a small amount of money and potentially make a lot of money out of it. I think that is the allure of trading. At the same time, though, you have to, like you said, be able to get into that flow state. And that only really happens when you enjoy the activity and you're able to spend a lot of time doing it, right? Which essentially means you're enjoying it. If you're forcibly trying to just trade, just to make money, and you're not really enjoying the activity or getting better or learning, then you're probably not going to succeed, right?
Right.
And so luckily for me, there was a whole new world of trading which I didn't know about, which is essentially called algorithmic trading. Algorithmic trading is what I realized I could apply myself towards and get better at. And essentially the idea there is you build algorithms, and using these algorithms, you trade the stock markets, right? And your models get programmed, right? So either you know how to code, or you work with someone who's a coder and they take your models and code them for you, which is essentially what I did, because I've never learned how to code. But what I enjoyed doing was just spending all my free time just coming up with these models. And, there's a process called backtesting, which is essentially when, let's say you have a model, right? So let's say your trading idea involves, you mentioned intraday trading. Let's say it's something as simple as finding the largest overnight losers and then buying them in the morning, right? So let's say, you might have noticed Adani's companies, they're very volatile, right? Oftentimes what happens is the market sometimes will cause the stock price to fall a lot overnight. And then when the market wakes up and sees that, people buy, right? Because they're trying to cover the short positions, or they realize, the market kind of, for whatever reason, punished that stock too much. So that could be your model, right? You can take that model and you can code it, right? And that's the whole idea behind algorithmic trading. And because you can code it, you can cover that entire universe of stocks, right? Very,
That's
very
interesting.
easily and very quickly.
Wow.
And you can do it within milliseconds, right? Because the computer program is trading for you essentially. But you have to come up with a model. And back
Okay.
testing is when you take that model and you test it historically, right? Because
Okay.
one of the things about the stock markets is that usually history repeats itself, right? And so, when you see something happen, as much as we want to say that, wow, this is so crazy, I can't believe this is happening, chances are it's happened before, or something similar has happened. So you take that model, test it historically, and then if it's profitable, then you can trade it live. So I would enjoy that process of back testing.
Okay.
That was
Back testing.
something
Okay.
I really enjoyed doing. And that allows you to get into flow state,
Got it. Got it. The
so yeah.
whole idea of, first probably, creating a hypothesis that, if something like this happens, and then, creating an algorithm in the sense, you don't have to really know coding if you're writing an algorithm. It's just that, okay, something like, Adani stocks, or, if there is a bad news about Adani, then it's going to fall. And by then, and whenever it goes up by, let's say, a 10% or 20%, sell it off and go and find different kinds of stocks in the history. You just go through the whole 10-year history of Adani stocks, or probably any market for that matter. And then apply it and see if it's working or not. And okay, so your product essentially is an algorithm. That's what gets into the flow state, finding new ideas, finding new models or hypotheses. Is that so?
Yeah, exactly. When I was a trader, right? So I don't trade
Okay.
anymore because
Okay.
the current product that we're building right now, it's not really involving active trading. It's more different type of a product. We're looking to gamify that stock trading experience.
I'll come to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But going back to what you're saying, exactly. And you used the word correctly there, hypothesis, right? Because you have to have a hypothesis, and you need to actually treat it like a science experiment, right? So in a science experiment, they say, you come up with a hypothesis, and when you come up with that hypothesis, you should not know what the results are, right? It's very important to conduct scientific experiments in an unbiased manner, right? So I can have maybe just a very small sample size, maybe just 1 or 5 or whatever. But I should not have any biases, because if I have a bias, that can lead me to essentially a wrong result, right?
Into a rabbit hole, essentially.
Exactly.
You keep going in the same direction then. Yeah.
Exactly, right? It also doesn't open up your mind to more possibilities, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So when you bring up that Adani observation, right? So one example of that could be, Adani has been, Adani Enterprises, the Adani Ports, all these Adani companies have been wildly volatile the past 1 or 2 weeks, right? Ever since that report came out. So I could look at that and say, wow, okay, this is interesting, right? A lot of volatility. How can I build some sort of a model around this, right? So I look at Adani Ports or Adani Enterprises stock data, right, which is available on Yahoo Finance, on Google Finance, and I can look for some sort of a pattern, right? Maybe like, okay, when the stock moves 10% in one direction, then I take the opposite direction the next day, right? Okay. And when you form that hypothesis, it should not just be anecdotal, right? It should not just be based off of that. There has to be a reason behind it too, right? Because ultimately, stock markets are driven by human beings, right? And human beings, we have something called a brain, obviously. And so the psychology is important to understand. There has to be a psychological reason for that
Greed
trade,
or fear,
right?
is it?
Exactly, right? Greed, fear. It could be something like, Well, if I was a trader and if my position went up a lot one day, I would want to take a profit, right? Or vice versa, right? If the market falls and if I have a position there, I want to cover my shorts. So the hypothesis can be when the stock moves, when any stock moves, say X%, then XYZ, right? So you have a cause and you have an effect, right? So the cause is when this happens, then I do this. So maybe the next morning I buy the stock. And then you also have to specify things like, when do you sell that? So let's say I buy the stock, then when do I sell, right? And these things, ideally, you want to come up with no bias, right? So you don't want to look at a sample size before coming up with all those rules. And there's a lot that goes into backtesting because there's all sorts of, there's all sorts of different biases, right? You have biases lurking in the back of your brain that you don't even know about, right? So, for example, something as simple as, like, as I mentioned, when do you exit that trade, right? You might have a bias in your head, but if you don't write down that rule, then one thing you might start doing is looking how your strategy performs based on different scenarios for that exit, right? So for example, let's say you buy at the market open and then you tell yourself, you know what? I don't know when to sell. So I'm just going to try out a bunch of different numbers, let's say 3:15 p.m., 3:16 p.m., all the way through different ranges. And I'm going to pick the exit that's the best, right? It sounds fine, right? It sounds like you're being super objective, but you're actually not, because you're actually picking that result which leads to the best outcome, right? And so you have to be very careful with bias. But yeah, that's essentially how, backtesting kind of works.
Yeah, I mean, essentially you have to close the loop. The loop needs to be closed. You start with a hypothesis, and then, the hypothesis has to have that, when to buy, when to sell. Otherwise, it's not an algorithm. You are changing the algorithm every now and then, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you told me that you moved to India. How was the experience? Just I'll keep my focus on, because you grew up in USA, and then coming to India and setting up a business here in India, and then you got into one of the most, I think, regulated market, right? The stock trading, which is highly regulated. So can you talk to me about the early start of upstox, and then the challenges that you have faced? If you can give some insights on that, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Honestly, moving was not difficult. This was back in 2008. So I was 23, not even 24 years old. I was single, I didn't have any commitments, which, is always very helpful, So if there's one thing I would say as an entrepreneur, definitely starting out when you don't have other things going on in life is just a huge advantage, right? Because you're not thinking about anything but your business. So, I was single. I had two other co-founders. We had some money in the bank, which is obviously helpful. And we had nothing to lose, right? Because we were moving to India. We were like, the foreign kids, right? Which is kind of ironic. But that's how we thought of ourselves. We thought of ourselves as foreign because this is back in 2008 when, obviously there were NRIs. But when it comes to setting up a stock brokerage as an NRI, no one was doing that, right? No one was really setting up a stock brokerage, much less doing it as an NRI, right? So we almost acted as if like we were playing with house money, right? We had nothing to lose. If things didn't work out, no problem. We can literally book a plane ticket, go back and do something else, And so psychologically, I think we were very good. We lived together. We were living literally just renting a house and just living a bachelor life, and it was awesome. We would party and we would. It was a lot of fun, right? And you're also trying to figure things out. We also had very specific rules, right? So it was me, my brother, my best friend from college. So each of us had certain rules, certain things that they brought to the table. I was like the trader, right? I was essentially the guy who was thinking of models, because even Upstox started off as a trading company, right? A proprietary trading company. We were actively trading the stock markets and basically using that money to fuel the brokerage entity, right? So it's almost like we had two different companies within one company. So I was overseeing the entire trading operation for the most part. And then my co-founder would code my model. So he was a technology guy. And then my brother was a business guy, right? So we all had our roles. And there's a lot of figuring out to do, right? I think especially because of the fact that we were in essentially a foreign country, there's a lot of figuring out to do. But I think when you are, as I mentioned, when you're kind of coming in at a left field, there's no pressure. There's no pressure. Social media didn't really exist. I mean, there was Facebook, but you only really posted things very sporadically on Facebook back then. And so it was very, no one was like looking over my shoulder, seeing how I was doing. And because of that, it kind of led to a very smooth experience. You mentioned Sebi. Yeah, Sebi, I think we always looked at Sebi in a very positive way, right? During our entire course of building up the company, and even in later years, Sebi was never ever seen as like this entity which we had to fear, or we had to kind of think of as a nuisance. Not at all. In fact, it's the complete opposite. And I think that's the proof is in the pudding, right? And India probably has one of the best regulated capital market structures in the world, if not number one, right?
Interesting.
Oh yeah. So because of that, whenever SEBI would issue a guideline or whatnot, we always welcomed it, right? Because ultimately, you also don't really have a choice, right? So you may as well just kind of welcome it. And then ultimately, it's about the end user's best interest, right? What's in their best interest? That's really what SEBI's thinking about,
Right. So, Upstox, when did you totally move to that? Because now I see Upstox. Have you exited Upstox?
I have not exited Upstox. I still have all my shareholding in the company. And I have no...
Who is running it actively?
My other co-founders. I have other co-founders in the company who are basically, kind of running the company. And there are 3 co-founders right now in Upstox. But
your brother and your best friend, are they still there?
They are still there. Yeah. So, and there's another co-founder as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So talk to me about, having your brother as a co-founder. How does it help, or does it, because, I had to find my co-founder, right? It was a bit of a task, whom to work with. It takes, because my co-founder, we both have been working together for the last 9 years now. Yeah. So it has been a long journey, and there have been ups and downs. But then having your brother as a co-founder, does it help at all?
I think it definitely helps if you have that kind of relationship with your sister or brother, right? But it's also, again, I think at what stage of your life you are, starting a business together, right? If one of you is married or has kids, it introduces a different dynamic, right? Not that it cannot be done. We see this happen all the time, right? Oftentimes, because when you're working with someone and both of you are thinking of the same thing 24 hours a day, and then all of a sudden one of you isn't, right? There's a new variable that gets introduced inevitably. And so it's very important to be able to navigate around that, right? So in our case, I think it worked out beautifully because we also had a very good understanding that each of us was bringing something, unique to that table, right? And so when you have that kind of understanding, it can work really well. And I would say, if you have that opportunity, definitely take advantage of it, right? Because you can't just buy that, and even finding a co-founder to work with, it's not going to lead to that same exact kind of organic association or relationship, right? Because you're still trying to figure each other out. Yeah.
It takes time to build up the relationship, and then, take advantage of the environment, the best of what you have, right?
Exactly. Right. So like even in my next company with Rain, my current co-founder and I, we had still known each other for almost 6 years, before deciding to become co-founders, and so we had kept in touch, for like a long time, and so it became very second nature. I mean, now thinking upon it, when we decided to start the company together, it wasn't a big deal, right? There was nothing like nerve-wracking about it because we had known each other. So definitely working with someone I think is always helpful, if possible. Otherwise, the flip side is also true. Like I think there's a pro and a con to each side of the coin.
Yeah, but it definitely helps, knowing, that's why, when I think about it, going to a college like an IIT or an NIT, wherein, you have an alumni network, you have people who have been in entrepreneurship, you have that connection. Going there definitely helps you in the start, it helps you with the getting started. And, people, who can be a good coder, who can be a good business guy, who can be a good customer support guy, stuff like that. That knowing people, otherwise it's just that, you hiring an agency, getting somebody, interviewing somebody, and then, it's just, it's like a lottery, somebody, can turn out to be really good, and somebody can, take away all your time. That happens. So definitely, for me, if I had to go back and restart, I would just go to a very good college, get some, really good friends, and then start with them rather than, starting the way that I had started. Yeah.
Yeah. The only thing I would say to that though, right, is see, when you hire someone for like a role in a company, if I'm hiring someone in the company, I'm going to go through that whole process, right, of interviewing and vetting them and checking their, recommendations and things like that, right? But in a co-founder, it's almost like a relationship, right? You're kind of, telling this person that, hey, like I'm looking to build something long-term with you. And so there has to be like a second degree level of trust, which you cannot really just like transact your way through, right? I mean, you can try, like I've always been curious, like when people go on like AngelList and look for co-founders, I'm like, that's really interesting, like, I don't know. Yeah.
That generation is different. I will tell you, people go on Tinder, probably, I would have never imagined going on Tinder and finding a date, right? It was always through a common friend or through school or somewhere, not to a complete stranger. We wouldn't be, I wouldn't have been able to do that. But these guys, they're doing it. It's a different mindset altogether. I think, Gen Z, millennials, I don't know if I'm part of a millennial generation or not, but then, I definitely do not, identify myself as a millennial or a Gen Z. So these guys, they have a very different mindset. So probably, AngelList, and then, you might have an app for wherein you can find a co-founder, but just swiping right, if both of you like each other. Probably there must be some app out there. Someone must have thought
too. See, what's interesting about that is, and this is something I keep reminding myself of every day. There's a new like breed of whether it's users or entrepreneurs or people using different social networks. Yeah, and specifically that Gen Z crowd you mentioned, right? With trading leagues where the target user group is a college going 18 to 21-year-old student, essentially,
Or
right?
Gen Z?
Gen Z, right? And so, and we're surprised all the time, right? Oftentimes the data will show us something which really surprises us in terms of how they consume apps. And what's really important here is to not judge, right? Like, because, like, and I do this, right? Like not knowingly, but it always happens unknowingly. But when you kind of, subconsciously, like when I have a bias essentially, right? When I'm kind of placing a value judgment at some level, I'm essentially saying, hey, like I'm not in touch, and so, yeah, you're right. Maybe the new way of doing business is actually to go and just find a co-founder. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you spoke about this trading leagues, but we'll get there. But the whole idea of that gamifying, you have been in algorithmic trading, and then you started a brokerage in India, and then moved to US. And how did this whole idea of dream 11 for traders came into picture? What inspired you to start trading leagues or rain platforms?
Yeah. So, when I started Rain, it was essentially in certain ways, I was thinking of it as a continuation of upstox. So the reason I even started Rain, and this question I get asked pretty often, because people wonder, like, why did you step down from a company that's doing so well? It was actually due to two basic reasons, right? Number one, I wanted to move back to the US, right? Because my kids were getting a little older. And my older son was, about to enter preschool, and I wanted to be there. And I was spending most of my time in India because, Upstox is an Indian company, right? So second thing is, the first reason was I wanted to move to the US. Second reason was I wanted to challenge myself because Upstox has three other co-founders, right? So I wanted to essentially say, hey, what can I do, right, to really challenge myself as an entrepreneur, and see what I can do outside of the purview of a stock brokerage, right, or SEBI, as you mentioned earlier. What can I do outside of the lens of SEBI, and still be aligned with increasing investor participation rates in India and globally, right? So that's really how Rain started. It started off as an idea. I know it sounds really weird, but that's literally how I started the company. And it's called Rain because I wanted to make it rain. So nothing too complicated about that. Yeah, exactly, right? Now within that, essentially the company pivoted, right? So we started off as a retail hedge fund that pivoted into a marketplace for algorithmic trading strategies. But none of that was scalable, right? And I think that's, another maybe theme to discuss is, like, if you're building a business, you have to understand what you're trying to build and how scalable you want that business to be, right? I mean, there's some businesses which have just maybe a handful of clients, right? If you're a B2B business with,
30, 40 odd clients giving you
exactly
$1 million a year. Yeah.
Exactly, right? That's one type of business. And then the other extreme is like something like trading leagues where, you have potentially millions of users, each doing essentially a lot of microtransactions every day, right? And so my co-founder, Harsh, basically he came up with the idea of trading leagues literally one night. He's like, hey, what if we gamified the whole stock trading experience? And we started talking about poker because, we both played a lot of poker in college.
I love poker.
Yeah, so poker is pretty amazing, right? I think it's such an amazing game. You can play for free. You can play for money. The competitive juices kick in. You can have different buy-ins.
Being able to understand what the other person is playing with. Then, the same thing is with your algorithmic trading, right? You want to set a hypothesis and see if it is right or not. So that I think if you like poker, you have that thing, because while we play poker, we can play poker for, hours and hours, for 7, 8 hours straight without getting bored. So that's something I think I can take that out of your previous, whatever we spoke about, algorithmic trading and getting into that flow state. So poker also gets you into the flow state, right?
Exactly. Poker does. It's because there's a strategy element there as well, right? But there's also the thrill associated with winning. There's the fact that it's a social construct, right, by default. So we looked at poker. We looked at, there's an entire industry called daily fantasy sports, right? So fantasy sports, basically, Dream 11 is what comes to mind in India, but there's many other companies now as well that fall within that.
On football, it's very big, fantasy football.
Exactly.
It's really big. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And so in the US, I was a big player, I guess, of fantasy basketball. Right.
Wow.
Basketball has always been very close to me. And so I would literally spend like hours sometimes, just building my fantasy basketball lineups. It's just so much fun. And in that process, you learn a lot about basketball, right? You learn a lot about, which players are actually adding value, who are the highest value players in the NBA. And it really introduces like a whole new dimension to that sport, right? And you can take that across any sport. You mentioned soccer, you can do cricket, you can do hockey, boxing, doesn't matter, because data is king, right? And so the idea was, how do we introduce something similar to the stock markets, where literally you take the same exact concept of a Dream 11 or, in the US, you have companies like DraftKings, FanDuel. These are daily fantasy sports companies, and then just replicate it for the stock markets, right? So that's the whole idea behind trading leagues. So we spent the whole year building it, and we just launched it,
So in this one, how much do you think it has to do with the mastery? When you said that you're getting better at basketball. Essentially, you're not playing basketball, but you are becoming better. You're mastering something. That does it apply there?
Yeah, I think. Well, yes and no, right? Because I think with trading, ultimately, you have something called opening up a brokerage account and trading through a brokerage, right? So the analogy with daily fantasy sports might be something, or let's say poker, right? Poker, the trading league's equivalent for poker might be, hanging out with your buddies on a Friday evening, getting some beer, and then, sitting around in someone's garage and playing poker throughout the night, right? And the big leagues arena would be something like going to a casino probably, or, maybe going to the World Series of Poker and becoming like a professional poker player, right? But to get to that professional stage, you need to probably go through a lot of games with your friends and, kind of working your way up, right? So that was the whole idea behind trading leagues. Like, how do you introduce people to the stock markets without forcing them or requiring them to open up a brokerage account, right? Because while opening up a brokerage account is really cool, and it can be thrilling and a lot of fun, ultimately you have to move a lot of money to your brokerage account, right? You're talking about people moving capital. And for many people, they either don't have that money, or when you think about that proposition, it's also a very ludicrous proposition. I mean, very rarely in life am I being asked to move a lot of money to something just to get started, right? It almost never happens, right? Unless maybe I'm buying a house or a car or something, and there, it's like an investment, right? But here, it's like, if I want to begin trading or investing, like through the stock markets, I need to move a lot of money. So that becomes like this weird catch-22, right? Because people never get started. And so when we talk about financial literacy, when we talk about people understanding what stocks are and things like that, they never get started because of these reasons,
Okay.
So that's something else we also wanted to solve with trading leagues.
Okay. So people essentially, here and they're not actually trading, they're picking up their stocks, building a portfolio, their portfolio, and essentially rank against their friends or other players in the platform, right? That's the whole
Exactly.
idea.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So we have like different types of games. One of the games involves building a portfolio.
Okay.
Another game type is you're basically day trading, off of a
Okay.
chart. And then you've got more simple games as well, where essentially forecasting the price of a stock. So the idea is to have different types of games catering to different, areas of difficulty, and different stages of a user's life.
Okay. Great. So,
Yeah.
do you mind sharing some numbers in terms of, how many monthly active users you have, or probably daily active users that you have of your of Trading Leagues, the mobile
Yeah.
app?
Yeah. I'm not going to get into the DAU, MAU numbers, but I'll just talk to you about at a meta level where we're at. So we've crossed 300,000 downloads, right?
Okay.
And we actually had to slow things down over the past few weeks because we needed to kind of stabilize the app, and we also need to kind of get a couple things in order.
Okay.
So we hit essentially 100,000 downloads very quickly. We just launched the app 6 weeks ago, right? So in the
Nice.
first 2 weeks, we crossed 100,000 downloads, and then we hit
Was it all
250.
organic?
It is organic, and we're also working with a couple paid marketing channels as well, right?
Okay.
And so one thing we also wanted to do was launch the app and then spend some time understanding the data, right?
Okay.
So, one thing I realized very quickly with Trading Leagues, which is very different than an upstox, is an app like Trading League scales much faster than an app like upstox, right? To put it into context, it took us about 6 years to get 100,000 downloads on upstox.
Upstox.
It took us like a week to get that here. It's just the nature of the business, right? Because in India, less than 4% of the population has a demat account, right? So we're building a Trading Leagues for the 96%. Yeah,
Do you have this app in India or focused on international markets or just Indian market?
right now it's focused on Indian markets, and we have plans to launch it in the US as well. Not anytime soon because that's a whole different process. But the idea is to, keep it in India, obviously keep improving the app, listen to our users, and then maybe when the time is right, we can launch it globally as well.
Right. Just out of this one mobile app space, I had been in that space for almost 6 years, and even today with Flyy, we work with a lot of mobile app companies. What do you think is the biggest challenge? You have worked in upstocks. Trading Leagues is fairly new, 6 weeks, but what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge when it comes to especially the mobile app space? I mean, just one, if you can think of, that probably must have bothered you in your upstocks days. What would be that? What would that be?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, in terms of what bothered us back then versus what's probably bothering, from the upstocks perspective, what's bothering the upstocks team now, and what I guess bothers us now is, I mean, those are very different equations, right? So maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago, our biggest thing was just distribution of the app and just getting it out. Obviously, mobile penetration was on the rise at that point in time. Nowadays, everyone has a smartphone, right? So you're talking about a different cohort of users now. So our issues that we faced were definitely different back then. But nowadays, I think it really comes down to maybe a couple things, right? I think from just the ease of anyone being able to quickly build an app, right, is unprecedented, and that's a one-directional play, right? So put it in context, my older son, who's 7 now, he's already taking programming classes, and he's, I wouldn't be surprised if he builds some sort of a mobile app within a few years. I mean, I'm not saying he will, right? But it's so easy now for anyone to build anything. So from a competitor landscape, not really underestimating that person next door, right? You know, anyone can build an app and probably compete against you. Now with an upstox, obviously you have to obtain a brokerage license and things like that, which creates some hoops. But even that is not a big deal, right? I think in our case, for us to obtain a brokerage license back in 2009 was a big deal. It was like a 2-year endeavor. Also because we were NRIs, we actually had to go through a lot more paperwork. But nowadays, it's probably not that big of a deal, right? The capital requirements to obtain a brokerage license have probably come down a lot. So that's one thing to keep in mind, right? Like not taking anything for granted. Second is just the breadth and of users and how your users can be anyone now, right? Like literally anybody. We talked about Gen Z, but it's not just about Gen Z, right? It can be like, you know, your driver, right? In India, you have drivers and you have maids. But it's not so crazy to think about like maybe, you know, a rickshaw driver, right? Having a smartphone and maybe taking some trades. In fact, someone posted this on LinkedIn last week where they literally had a conversation with, you know, with their, I think it was their auto driver, right? And he was actually investing, which is such a cool story. But I also read that. I'm like, why is this a LinkedIn post? This is not even that crazy of a post, you know? That's kind of where we've reached today, where anybody can be doing anything and it's not a big deal. In fact, it might get frowned upon to put out that post, you know, because you're maybe in a very weird way talking about elitism and things like that, right? So, you know, that concept of elitism doesn't exist, I think. And so when you're building an app, you need to keep that in mind. And I think even from a, maybe not really related to mobile, but just generally, you know, especially with Gen Z, I would say, and even there, I have to be careful to not stereotype, right? I actually try to avoid labeling because certain biases creep in when you label. But if you are dealing with a younger audience, they're going to be more unforgiving, right? They don't need to really listen to anything you say. And so, you know, that the idea of like the customer being loyal, I think in a good way, right? I think in a good way doesn't exist as much these days, right? And I mean that in a very positive way, right? Because the customer is king. And so they have all the options, right? If they're not happy, they uninstall and move on, you know?
That's so. Uninstall is one of the biggest challenge that any mobile app faces, mobile app company faces. Customer retention, you know, bringing them back into it. Yeah. So coming to, you know, this gamification bit, you know, what is there a team for you, you know, who are actively in your company, you know, looking into the whole gamification, not just, you know, points leaderboard, not the basic things, but deep diving into what gamification is? Is there a team doing it? Is that the whole idea of RAIN platforms? Does it work like that?
Yeah, definitely. Right. So we, I mean, we do have a team. When I say team, you know, it's a pretty small team. So we're kind of all doing everything. But definitely one thing we're trying to get better at is understanding our users. So both, you know, Harsh and I, my co-founder, we come from hardcore kind of trading backgrounds, right? And he was also managing a hedge fund, which is kind of as, quote, elitist as it gets, right? Not saying Harsh is elitist, of course, but that's really the world that we've come from. We're going from that to, you know, anyone can come in and play games on trading leagues for as low as 5 or 10 rupees, right? And so when you're going from managing millions and millions of dollars to this space, it's not just the business model, it's also really understanding your users, right? So one thing, you know, we're realizing very quickly with the gaming space is that, again, you know, not to sound cliche, but the customer is king, and the customer just doesn't give a crap, right? Like they're looking for a good gaming experience, and if they don't like something, you know, it's in their full right to move on to the next gaming app. And there's a lot of gaming apps, right? So even though we want to think of ourselves as being a little special because we're also trying to nudge that user towards thinking about stocks differently. Ultimately, one thing we're realizing is a gamer is a gamer, right? You talked about being a poker player. You and I play poker because there's certain thrills that we associate with poker, right? Similarly, in India, you have 50 crore plus gamers, right? This is people who have played gaming apps or played games in their free time. And so that mindset is very different than someone trading on a brokerage application, right? So understanding those users and understanding that there's so many gaming apps out there, you want to win them over through other ways, right? There's a really good LinkedIn post I saw recently where this guy essentially is schooling the HR manager of a company, right? So this HR manager goes to this guy and says, hey, we're losing a lot of our employees, right? Because of better pay or better opportunities. What can we do to retain them, right? Maybe you've seen this. It's a viral video on LinkedIn.
Okay.
And the guy is like, and so, the HR guy's like, what can we do to retain our best hires? Should we pay them more? What do we do, right? And the consultant says, the second you start thinking like that, you're thinking about it the wrong way, right? Because they're not necessarily interested in more pay, right? They're not interested in necessarily even the better job, right? They're actually looking to build skills. And they're also thinking about how are you treating them as human beings, right? Because
That's very important.
Exactly, because the way our parents thought about jobs is very different than the way their parents thought about jobs, which is very different than the way the current generation thinks about jobs, right? Our parents and my dad, I can speak from experience. He was seeking greener pastures, right? He left India to seek greener pastures, and he was just looking for a job which paid him well, right? And his parents, it was more about necessity. You had to have a job, right, to just survive, right? But nowadays, it's more about, people go where they feel like they're getting better, right? They're building skills, and also how they're being treated, right? The users are the same way, right? Your users are also trying to think about, yes, of course, they want to have fun, right? Especially with gaming, I'm talking about. For sure, the thrill experience is there. But if you're going to be building an app that also nudges them towards the financial markets, are they actually learning something, right, with the financial markets? And also, is their feedback being heard, right? So paying a lot of attention to the Google Play reviews, or just getting that feedback from users and not ignoring it is probably more important now than, ever before,
So I'm not sure if you have read this because you talked about HR and then, about your application. So have you read this book called Drive, by Daniel H. Pink? Have you read that book?
I think I've heard of the author. Maybe he's written.
He has written many books. So in that book, he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. These are the three core aspects of, how to get, it was written in the context of workplace, how to build a better company. So these are the three important aspects, which I think are the most important aspects when it comes to gamification. For me, gamification is more of a way of life, life itself, if you break it down, we are human beings, we are driven, we want to have control over what we are working on or anything for that matter. And then, that sense of mastery, if you're playing a game like poker, you want to master it. And then the third one is, for the higher purpose. Why are we playing it? Why are we playing that game? Everyone has that. So probably, this particular aspect, if you apply in, this could be a simple advice for you. If you, probably your team can put that into picture, read those books like, Drive and then, actionable gamification. These are the things that can really, widen their scope when it comes to, the kind of ideas that needs to be applied. Because I see that that's what you guys are trying to solve, educate the audience, the 96% of the people and for them to get into trading. And do you know about this game called Cash Flow? Just out of curiosity, I wanted to ask. Cash Flow by Robert Kiyosaki. He has written a book called The Rich Dad Poor Dad.
Yeah. I've read that. Yeah.
what he tells is he actually wrote that book as a guide to this game called Cash Flow. It's a board game similar to Monopoly, but
Okay.
yeah, it really teaches you a lot about personal finance. So probably look into that. That could help, build a better gaming experience, because I have that game and I've paid for that game in the mobile. I've bought it for, I think, $3-4 or so.
Sure.
That game. So first game that I've paid for.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
so which by the way is a big deal, right? You talked about trust. Mastery is definitely, you want to nudge users towards a semblance of mastery. But the reality is with stocks, you also don't want to mislead people, right? You're never going to master stocks, right? It's more about being as informed as possible. But trust is a big one. And the fact that, you talked about this app and you bought it, that's a big deal, right? Because when you imagine how many apps you've gone through, and then how many of them you've actually become a paid user of,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Raghu, I think we are running. I mean, I don't want to take much of your time, but then just as a closing, to close this conversation, if you can give, probably one or two lines for the upcoming entrepreneurs, and how to basically essentially stay at it, because one line that stuck with me, and even today. One of the person, he told me that if you're getting, he was a Marwadi guy. Marwadi, I'm not, their business community in India. So he told me, if you're getting started, remember, you have to give 1,000 days to your business. Yeah, like three more than, if you can't give 1,000 days to your business, then it's not going to go anywhere. You have to have that much time in hand. So what would you give? What kind of advice would you give to the upcoming, or probably the entrepreneurs who have just started up, or probably are looking to get started?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple, man. I think number one, I would say you cannot just do it for the money, right? If you do anything for the money, whether it's entrepreneurship or even I would say a job, right, or anything in life, right? If you're doing it just for the money, then I would say you're probably not going to succeed, right? I'm just gonna put it out there. But then secondly, make sure there is the potential to make money, right? So you want to make sure that both those things are aligned.
Money is the fuel.
Yeah. 100%. I mean, that has to be there as well, right? You're not doing charity work here. You're basically trying to build.
That should not be the goal, but then it has to be.
Yeah. You have to keep those two things probably equally weighed, right? You want to do something you're good at, that you enjoy doing, which is important, because if you don't really enjoy it, you're not going to spend time on it, especially when things are not going well, right? So it's kind of a recipe for disaster. But you also want a scalable idea, scalable business. Obviously building a good team, right? You want to work with the right people. Kind of touching back upon what we discussed earlier, if it's organic, the better, right? If it's not, no problem. And I would just say, don't give up, right? Nothing is easy. It's supposed to be really, really hard. I keep reminding myself of that all the time, right? Whenever we're going through any sort of a difficult situation, it happens in every single business. It's supposed to be difficult. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it, right? And that's the truth, right? We're not that different as human beings, right? As much as I want to think that, maybe I'm special, or, we want to feel that we're special, we're not. We're all very, very similar. It's just that some people are willing to take certain risks and others are not, right? And so, I think if you try to simplify it, keep it fun, try to enjoy it, then you're probably going to do decent,
You won't play a game unless you enjoy it,
Exactly, right? So, 100%.
Yeah. So, thank you so much, Raghu. For almost an hour, we spoke about your journey.